Here at the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum, next to the Hamilton International Airport at Mount Hope, we have one of the 2 Lancasters in the world that still fly. When it flies, as well as its assigned crew of 4, it can carry 4 more people. Wes Allen and myself, my name's Ted Lowry, meet people from all over the world who come to Hamilton, to our museum, to fly in our Lancaster. Once in a while, we meet an older gentleman who identifies himself as having been a Lancaster crew member during World War II. After a break of 60 years, he wants just one more flight on a Lancaster. "How many operations, missions did you go on?" asked Wes or I. 8 or 17 or 27 are typical answers. About once a summer, we get an answer like 8.5. Wes and I know what that means. That means the last flight was a one-way flight. The Lancaster may have gotten to the target, but it never returned to its base. It was shot down. Our older visitor's war effort, his contribution to all of the freedoms we have today, ended in a prisoner of war camp. And here he is, 60 years later, flying in a Lancaster, just one more time. As he climbs on, surely he must think about the last time he did this and what the results were. We wonder, does he think of his wartime buddies, some of whom he was never to see again? Do Wes and I take extra care with these special visitors? Wouldn't you? Russell Lowry was a Hamilton boy who became a Halifax navigator. He speaks of the unspoken fear that bomber crews had as they set out on each operation. He believes the fears could have been stronger for the married men.
He always had a funny feeling, gee, this might be my last.
Russell's Halifax was shot down over Germany. Parachuting out of a burning aircraft was a frightening experience. Of course, the alternative was worse.
This is where we got knocked off at 18,000 feet. 2 fighters got us. And pilot says, abandon aircraft. Well, 3 of us got out.
Bob Halfnight joined the RCAF at age 20. He became a navigator. On his 17th operation, October 31, 1944, his luck ran out. His aircraft was hit. He parachuted out and became a prisoner of war. and yet he says he was lucky. Let Bob tell you about the numbers of men that were lost, and then what it was like to be shot out of the sky.
At the outset, I must tell you that my experience was not unique. There were nearly 2,500 RCAF aircrew taken prisoner, hardly an exclusive club. However, we were the lucky ones. For every airman who survived as a POW, there were 6 killed in action. In my own crew of 7, only the wireless air gunner and I made it home. In any case, a Messerschmitt 110 night fighter got on our tail, and we were suddenly into strenuous evasive action. We lost our outboard starboard engine, and flames were streaming out from that wing. There was a partially full fuel tank right where the fire was raging. Full tanks were in little danger of exploding, but partially full or empty tanks had fumes, a deadly mixture of fuel and air. According to the manual, we had little time for bailout before the plane would explode. Bailout was ordered, probably starting at somewhere about 10,000 feet of altitude. Now, parachuting means different things in different services. In the case of Army paratroops, their jump was the start of their mission. They did practice jumps as part of their training. For bomber crews, parachuting was the end of the mission. No jumps were taken in training. Personal survival was the only purpose. Now, it is difficult to describe the bedlam in the plane at that moment. First, there was the awesome noise of enemy cannon shells hitting our plane, while at the same time our guns were firing full blast. Then, with escape hatches open and earphones and helmets removed, ears were subjected to unbelievable noise levels. Then, complete silence. Once free of the plane and dropping very rapidly, before the parachute opened, ears plugged immediately. Then the chute opened. One had escaped the bedlam and was gently and quietly descending in total silence. I couldn't hear a thing. It was a clear night with great visibility. There was much to observe, with air battles and exploding anti-aircraft shells above and all sorts of activities below. Our abandoned plane was easy to follow with its streamers of fire. Instead of exploding mid-air as suggested, it followed a stable downward path, finally exploding on contact with the ground. So much for conventional wisdom. I was the fourth to bail out. The flight engineer and the bomb aimer exited from the forward hatch, and the wireless operator preceded me out of the mid-hatch. I could see the 3 open chutes below me. The remaining 3 were not incapacitated, and with the plane in stable flight, there is no reason why they shouldn't have also made the jump. I've often been asked if we crew members made contact with each other once in the ground. The answer is no. Traveling at a speed of about 3 miles per minute, 20-second jump intervals would place one at least a mile from his nearest crew member when he hits the ground. And that would be at night too. And in contrast with the slow, gentle descent mentioned above, the final 500 feet came up to meet me at incredible speed. It was a rough landing, but unfortunately I was unharmed.
Thomas Lane was a Canadian pilot who served with the Royal Air Force. He trained at Mount Hope, learning to fly on a Fleet Finch trainer. He became a Halifax pilot, and ultimately he and his crew became Pathfinders. Pathfinders were flight leaders, the first ones over a target area, who marked targets with various kinds of devices. Having already completed 1 tour of operations, he was on his 40th operation when,
on the June the 21st, 22nd, 1943, on our 40th trip, 2nd tour, we were lead target markers for the main bomber force on the main target in Krefeld in Germany. We had successfully marked the target and were on our return flight to base when we were shot down over Holland by a German night fighter, and our entire crew later become prisoners of war. This same German night fighter had shot down, before he was killed, had shot down 50 bombers, and he was killed the night of September the 26th, 27th, 1943, in a crash between 2 aircraft landing at his own aerodrome in Germany.
The whole crew was able to bail out and survive. This was not the norm.
As I said, successfully marked the target, and we were returning home, and obviously we were shot down, so our entire crew became prisoners of war, as we call them, POWs. And that again is a very unique situation. There are not too many, not a very high percentage of crews where they all lived after being shot down.
Eric Grove was the Lancaster pilot. The pilot is the one in charge. He was the one who made the vital decisions. If an aircraft was hit, it was the pilot who decided whether the aircraft should be abandoned or could it be kept flying. Did Eric make the right decision?
I screwed round in my seat to the left and looked down the fuselage, and if you go into the cockpit again, you can see right down the fuselage. I could see through the mid-upper turret, and there was nobody in it. The rear turret was turned fully at 90 degrees to its side. Now that's the standard position for the rear gunner to bail out. He turns it to one side or the other and simply bails out. And so I looked down, and I thought to myself, he's gone, or he's going. The mid-upper, there's nobody in it, so he must have fallen out or been killed or over the guns or something. And I can remember this very clearly. I had 50 or 60 years now to think about this. Here I am at about 12 or 14,000 feet with an airplane that won't go out, still burning, with bombs that are live, with no signaling system, no means of communication, no defences, 750 miles from home. Now, what do? I can get out 5 live members, I know, because the bomb aimer's there, I'm here. The radio operator, I know he's there because, and somebody else is there, the first 5. I thought, they're there, I know they're there, so what shall I do? I could have, and this is a big question, it's been with me now for a long time. I could have flown it, attempted to fly it back to England with a night fighter still behind me and a blaring target in the sky. I could have gone down to a lower level and tried to fly back 700 miles, 3 hours back to England. Not with the fire not out, no defences. I'd have got a VC if I'd done that, I know that. Or I can say to myself, 5 dead live airmen are better than dead 7 ones, and will give the order to bail out. So I gave the order to bail out. And that's been a good question in my life ever since. Did I make the right decision? I'll never know the answer to that. Anyway, we went out, 5 survived. The 2 gunners were killed. We landed south of Berlin.
Of the 7 crewmen, the 2 gunners were killed. The other 5 crew escaped, as it turned out, unhurt. The pilot is the last one to abandon the damaged plane.
When I decided that it was time for us to go, I yelled and hollered and waved at everybody, and they all went out. One after the other, and I was sort of watching them go out like this, you know, sort of. And the last guy was some minutes in going, and I said, come on, get out, you know, sort of shouting and screaming and coming. And as he came past me, he gave me some, he said, you better have this, you might need it. And he gave me my parachute, and I'd clean forgotten it, and I would have gone out through the front there without it. I'd clean forgotten it. The second little anecdote about that is that if you look under the nose of the Lancaster, you'll see there's a square exit. That's where you go out in an emergency. And the drill is you sit on the front of the seat like this, and you cross your arms across your chest, and one of them, I don't know which one it is now, you hold the release cord of your parachute, and you roll, there's just enough room, you roll forward out the hatch and count to 10 and pull the rip cord. And so of course I did, I've now got my parachute on all right. So everybody had gone, the aeroplane was there, and I was trying to get out, it was still burning like a torch. I could see the whole aeroplane, the flames were so big, it was simply getting worse and worse, there was no question. I couldn't have put that fire out. The fire extinguisher was a peanut, you know, it wasn't worth it. So I sat on the edge of the hatch and crossed my arms and rolled out and went 1, 2, 3, Pass it on 10. And pull the recorder. Those are the two things I remember.
Eric Grove tells us what it was like to be captured. What was it like? Was he scared?
And a flashlight came on, and a bandit ended up in front of one of those, and the voice said, "Halt!" And that was it. It was a German army military convoy going to the north, and they got a sentry on board, and that was it. I was in the bag. So they took me into the building, which turned by the side, which turned out to be a tavern. I guess the drivers were just having a drink for a spell, and they stripped me down. Everybody said, "Terrorflieger, Terrorflieger, Terrorflieger," and Bomben Berlin, Bomben Berlin. I was scared shitless, of course. And they stripped me down, and they searched me, and they found a few other things. We had a number of escape devices: a compass, a map, and a little case with money in it, and chocolate, and a water carrier, and a few things. And I'd taken the money out and buried it, because a lot of it was French and German money, and English money, by the way. We didn't want this getting into the hand of German spies, so I buried this. But the other stuff, the chocolate, the Germans, they were like saucers when they saw this chocolate, and they broke it up, gave it to themselves. I don't think they'd seen chocolates since the war began.
For downed airmen, their greatest danger was from German civilians. Because the airmen, if skillfully interrogated, could be the source of valuable information, they were protected by the German military. Captured Allied airmen were more valuable than angry German civilians.
And the German population attacked us. After all, they'd been bombed 3 times in 5 nights, so they were not feeling very happy about these Terrorfliegers. And they attacked us. And the German, by this time the Luftwaffe, had no compunction. They just turned their guns on their own people. And they shot them, and they just turned their rifles around and smashed them down, knocked them down. We were valuable. We might have secrets, you see. It was from us that the Germans collected a lot of intelligence, by hook or by crook. And so we were valuable, and their instructors were to get us to Frankfurt and Maine, which is a good couple of 100 miles to the east. Now, they did it.
Eric was interrogated.
We stayed in the cell until a German officer interviewed us. And as is the story, and it's exactly told in this book, he was immaculate. He was the absolute epitome of what a Prussian German officer should be. He had highly polished boots, highly polished, with the trousers that came up. His uniform fitted perfectly. He had an iron cross, remember that, and he had a number of decorations here. And it was absolutely spotless, absolutely spotless. His hair was perfectly groomed. His fingers were like a model's fingers. It's unbelievable in the middle of a war, you know. Anyway, he invited us in, and "Come in, Mr. Grove, please come in, Mr. Grove, sit down. I'm so pleased to see that you weren't hurt in your unfortunate episode," and stuff like that. And he was very nice to us and asked us a whole series of questions, most of which we didn't answer. And I'm taking credit for most of it, but I didn't answer them. I had no defense about what he was asking me except silence. I didn't attempt to back answer him or attempt to reply to his comments. I simply didn't respond. I said my name and rank and number is, and that was it. And he, in turn, he got angry and his face got red, and he gave me a cigarette at first. And I smoked it. I smoked at that time, so I took a cigarette and smoked it. And I think it was about halfway through when he started to change his tack and got angry and telling me, unless you reply, "Well, you don't have any name, rank or badge, you know, we know you're a spy. We'll send you off to the Gestapo. You know what the Gestapo do to spies?" That kind of nonsense, you know.
Thomas Lane tells us how unsettling it was to be interrogated. German interrogators were well prepared.
Upon arriving at Amsterdam for an initial interrogation and giving my name, rank, and officer's number to a German interrogation officer who spoke fluent English, far better English than I ever spoke, He left. The next day he returned and he said to me, "What took you so long? We've been waiting for you. We've been expecting you." He produced the authentic RAF flight magazine in which my DFC had been gazetted and said to me, "We know all about you." He proceeded to tell me more about my squadron, its officers, etc., and myself than I knew.
What was life like in prisoner of war camps? Once captured, were prisoners completely isolated from the events of the war? What could they possibly have that was of any value? Let Bob Halfnight try to answer these questions.
Fairly regularly, we received Red Cross parcels, which along with other things contained cigarettes. At that time in Germany, cigarettes were more valuable and useful than currency. Our guards were always willing to do a little under-the-table dealing to get their nicotine fix. While still in the prison camp, we were quite knowledgeable about the progress of the war. With cigarettes as a currency, POWs were able to purchase various radio components from the guards and put together a wireless receiver. I'll never forget my first day in camp. It was noon, and all conversation in the barracks stopped while one of our guys read the BBC News just received. The radios were well hidden from the guards. In major searches, they would sometimes uncover one, but another was always in reserve. Consequently, we probably knew more about the actual battle situation than the German guards.
There was a great abundance of ingenuity in camps, a certain tolerance by their captors of the things that were important to the captives, and an awareness of the humor in things that were happening. Russell Lowry tells us of some of these events.
There are some fellows what they could do with pieces of metal and that. So one fellow in our camp, he's an Australian, in our block. He was an Australian. He built a still for us. So what are we going to do now? We're going to distill some booze. So we get our regular Red Cross parcels every week, except when they don't come. We got probably every other week or so, but Red Cross parcels always had prunes and raisins in. So we all that want to get in volunteered or raisins. We had an old wooden bathtub there. I don't know anyone ever used it, but there was a wooden bathtub, and we put all our raisins and prunes in this basket, in this tub, and water. And some fellows knew how to make wine. They made some kind of wine. Well, then we double distilled it with this equipment. So Christmas of '43, we got into this straight alcohol. Oh boy. There was a Catholic lad, his name was Sullivan from the Marasheen. He was a good Catholic. And he says, I always go to church Christmas Eve. There's a priest there. We had our own little chapel. And I can't miss out on going to church Christmas Eve. But anyways, Sullivan got into this alcohol pretty good. So he says, I got to go to church. So two of us carried him over to the church. We were allowed to move around a little bit that night, and we stood him up against the wall. And I don't think he knew until the next day someone brought him back that he'd been to church that night, but he felt greatly relieved. He was a good Irish Mick. But anyways, he was a good guy too. But those little incidents happened, but the hangover we had and that stuff, it took you a week to get it out of your system. But some fellows tried to climb the fence and one thing and another, and the Germans had to shoot at them. They didn't kill, they shoot it to kill. So after that, they didn't let us make any more brew.
Don't ever think that all POW life consisted of events that were fun to remember years later. Russell Lowry was in a POW camp in which escape tunnels were dug. To try to escape was a very serious offense, and if caught, the punishment was swift and savage. Russell tells us of this.
See, we lift the stove out and they go down. Now, as I say, I've never in the tunnel. We had electric lights in the tunnel. We had little carts then that carried the fellows through the tunnel. We knew what the shoring come from. There's various stop stations where you could stop off, and if you had to, anything broke down, you could localize people. And then the day for the Great Escape come, we, all those who worked on it, were, I think they figured 200 of us. We drew lots. Now, when I say we drew a lot, the fellows that were European born and knew the language, they were the first qualifiers. There's a good chance of them getting back to their own homes. The rest of us, well, the fellows that were very senior in the tunnel operation, they were given the priority. Remember, my number was 150. Well, just as well I wouldn't have been here today if it had been low. But anyways, we were given, we were told to hard ass it over the mountains into Czechoslovakia, and we were given some kind of a passport. I don't know what it was. I don't remember now what it was. But I remember this paper that Russell Lowry has permission to go through, which doesn't mean anything. That night, the tunnel, we were all confined in one hut. During the day, they moved in, and we had the 200 of us in that one hut. This is Scruffy Weir's hut, as a matter of fact. And it started, just as soon as it got dark, the boys start going out. You know, we go along pretty good. Well, then there was an air raid in Berlin that night, and the power was turned off. So our tunnel operation was shut down. And then when it started again, it was discovered the other end. 75 fellows got out, which is an achievement in itself. And they spread out all over Europe at the time, but a few days later, they gathered them all up and brought them back, partway back. They had to get out and relieve themselves, and the machine guns were just turned on them. They murdered 50 of them, right there.
Thomas Lane spent 2 years as a POW. Conditions, especially the availability of food, were not good. However, after freedom came, most men recovered.
I had jaundice. We were very short of food. From about the end of January till somewhere in the middle of March, that January 1945 to about the middle of March 1945, when some Norwegian prisoners of war, Army officers, Air Force officers, who were receiving Danish prisoner of war parcels, donated some to us. So many of us, many became ill. But I suppose you look at me now and you might say, well, how, it's amazing what the human body will stand.
Eric Grove describes the vastness of a POW camp near Dresden and some of the antagonisms of camp life.
We were marched up from the station in whatever way we could, and we tried to look as smart as we could. We marched up through those gates into that camp where I stayed for the next 18 months. The theory was, and that began to work, the theory was that we had to try to escape. Escape from a camp like that was surrounded by 2 triple fences of barbed wire set apart, and a couple of tripwires inside and outside those. It was in the middle of a great, vast agricultural plain, miles from any town. We were not that far from Dresden, and we were witness to the bombing of Dresden later on. But the area was as flat as a pancake, and so getting out of it unseen was impossible. So what we did, the camp was a big one. It had about, all told, it had about 25,000, 30,000 people, and it had people from all over the world. From various times we had British, Canadian, American, Russian, Italian partisans, French, Danish, Dutch, in different compounds, as they were called. That's maybe 10 or a dozen huts together, surrounded by barbed wire. Strictly speaking, we were not supposed to fraternize among one another. We were supposed to stay where we were. But we I mean, the biggest problem in prison camp was boredom. Now, I want to come back to a point I made earlier on, is that at this time, the invasion had not occurred. This is November or December 1943, and we didn't know whether we were going to win the war or not. Most of the people in the camp had been captured long before. Many of them had captured in France during 1940. So it was a fairly depressing scene. We were not sure whether we were going to win the war and get out of this or not. So the biggest threat, I think, in prison camp was keeping your sanity. Occasionally we would have a visit of a fairly senior officer, usually Luftwaffe. And they were always immaculately dressed. They would come round to see us pigs, and we were pigs, because our conditions in the 1914 transit camp was not exactly designed as a deluxe hotel. It was pretty dirty, pretty filthy. It smelled, and we were full of lice and God knows what else. And various other diseases that were running around. Pardon me. One of the reasons I talked to you earlier about my stomach is that's where my stomach problems, I think, originated, was in that camp, 2 years in that camp. And anyway, these immaculate fellows came round to us, I think, to put us down. So we had to find ways of getting our own back. And we did this in other ways. We would suddenly run out from, they would walk down between the huts, these officers, and they sometimes with a guard, sometimes on their own. We would run across the front of them or run across the back of them, or we would pull a wagon across the front of them slowly to force them to stop and stand and shout. Anything minor. We were unarmed, they were fully armed. So all we could do was to irritate them. So my particular métier was to pass this, he must have been a colonel or something like this. And I didn't have my cap on. My hair was about 3 times as long as this in those days. No, it had been shortened. The Germans had shaved me off. That's right. But I was looking scruffy. My uniform, as you can imagine, having gone through what it was, pretty dirty. The only thing I had. I think I was unshaven. I should have brought a picture that the Germans took of me. Anyway, he came down the hut slowly, not looking, except glancing from his eyes from side to side. And I ambled up in the opposite direction. In theory, as I got past him, I should have snapped out a salute. But I decided to be a cussing. So I looked the other way and put my head in the air and whistled. And just ambled past him as though he wasn't there. Boy, did he get mad. He hollered and shouted at me and swore and screamed. And a couple of other fellows who were going by said, "You better be careful, he's getting mad." So I just carried on. Everybody knew what we were. I mean, we were all doing it. And finally somebody said, "You better stop," because he's got his gun out. And he had his gun out, and I thought, well, I better stop, I suppose. So I turned around, still with my hands in my pockets, and kind of turned around, and he got his gun right in the centre of my chest, in the middle of my back. My back still crawls at the feel of that bullet. Anyway, I was marched off duly to the chief British officer, or chief prisoner of war, known as a man of confidence, made to apologise and thrown in the cooler, the solitary confinement for a day for my sins, and that was it. I sincerely hope I gave him bad liver for the rest of the day, but that was as much as we could do.
As the Western Allied armies advanced and gained control of Europe, prisoners were liberated from their German POW camps. Russell Lowry was freed and fairly quickly returned to England. What a change it must have been. In a very short time, Russell went from being a prisoner in Germany to being able to walk into a British pub for a few pints of beer.
They get through the next day when then the 8th Army Group under Montgomery came through. One of the finest sights I ever saw is to the side of the road and see the victorious army go through. with their tanks and their other motor vehicles, and all waving to you and everything. And we were then moved into the local town, and the German officers, a lot of the German officers were surrendering them. And I don't know what kind of aircraft. It might have been a Halifax for all I know. We were so glad to get back. We were deloused and everything. And somehow or other, we were taken back to Bournemouth, and I got my clothes back. I got all my things back, my personal belongings. Went around the squad, and I guess either someone must have packaged it all up, and it was back there waiting for me.
With the Allies overwhelming the German armies on all fronts, being liberated, if I may use that word, by the Russians was not a guarantee of immediate freedom. Thomas Lane explains.
The Russian army overran our camp on April the 21st, 1945, and we essentially became Russian hostages. I escaped from this camp and made it across the Elbe River into the American-controlled area on May the 8th, 1945. This was VE Day celebrations for many, but for me, an escape from Russian-controlled hands into freedom.
Of course, with the loss of an aircraft, many airmen lost their lives. The result was that they were never to return to their loved ones, never to return to their homes. But we've been listening to airmen who lost their freedom. What were the results for them? What emotions do they still carry with them? Russell Lowry, thinking back to the night he was shot down, says,
You've flown with 7 guys through bad, good, and indifferent weather and different conditions. All good fellows, 4 of them went down with the aircraft. Why you got out, you don't know. But there was someone looking after us, I guess, and they said,
Indeed, more than a half-century later, when the 90-year-old is asked his opinion of war, he says,
lots about war. They're terrible. They're nothing to be gained. Because they're going to kill innocent people, nice people, good people. I'm very much against war.